At 6:07 a.m., while the morning fog still clung to Bluefinch Lake like a thick blanket draped over sleeping water, I watched in complete disbelief as a perfectly manicured hand wearing a pearl tennis bracelet reached straight through my car window and yanked my entire curing from the ignition with a practiced motion of someone who'd done this before. The woman attached to that hand, our self-appointed supreme leader and HOA president, Deirdre Pike, held my house keys up like she just captured enemy intelligence, and declared with an insufferable tone of absolute authority that this was official association business, requiring immediate compliance under penalty of further action. Behind her, idling at my private dock like some kind of nautical assault vehicle preparing for an amphibious invasion, was a pontoon boat decorated with a professionally printed banner that read, "Welcome Board Inspection Flotilla," in bold letters that somehow managed to look both festive and threatening at the same time. 3 other board members sat in the boat wearing matching visors and holding clipboards, looking like they were about to storm Normandy Beach, armed with violation notices and measuring tapes. One of them was actually filming the whole thing on her phone, apparently creating what they called documentary evidence of no. My name is Marcus Hale, and at 41 years old, I thought I'd found my perfect retreat from the chaos of corporate life when I bought this place 2 years ago after my divorce. I'm a software developer by trade, a woodworker by passion, and the owner of a modest cedar-sided lake house in Maple Key, a supposedly peaceful community where the loons sing at dusk, and apparently the HOA can find you $200 for what they call non-compliant Adirondack chair angles, which means your chairs aren't positioned at exactly 45 to the shoreline, according to the diagram in subsection 8 of the Outdoor Furniture Mandate. Deirdre Pike had been HOA president for 3 years, after orchestrating what locals call the Valentine's Day coup, where she got the previous president voted out for the crime of approving the wrong shade of beige for the community mailbox posts. She wielded that position like a medieval lord ruling over peasants who dared to plant the wrong shade of petunias or hang wind chimes without prior written approval. Her smile was the kind that never reached her eyes, a punctuation mark around unspoken threats that said, "You're about to get a certified letter delivered by a process server." Before me, she'd driven out the Hendersons for having a vegetable garden that was visible from the road, and the Johnsons for painting their shed door forest green instead of hunter green. I kept to myself, mostly enjoying my morning coffee, while watching the sunrise paint the lake in shades of gold and amber, taking my kayak out at sunset when the water turned to glass, and spending weekends in my workshop turning pieces of driftwood into decorative bowls that I'd gift to friends or donate to the local art center for their fundraisers. According to Deirdre, my quiet lifestyle made me evasively serene and potentially subversive, and she seemed to take personal offense to anyone who wasn't actively participating in her vision of community conformity, which apparently meant attending her mandatory monthly seminars on topics like synchronized lawn mowing, patterns, and the proper way to arrange deck furniture for maximum curb appeal. The harassment started about 6 months ago with a formal warning letter on official HOA letterhead claiming my dock aesthetic was insufficiently heritage, whatever that meant in her twisted vocabulary of mad-up violations. The letter included a helpful diagram showing the approved dock configurations, none of which looked anything like actual docks, but more like architectural fever dreams designed by someone who'd never actually been on a lake. She'd hired what she called a heritage consultant, who was actually just her nephew with a graphic design degree, to create a 70-page style guide for acceptable lakefront presentations. Then came a $75 ticket for unsanctioned wildlife encouragement, because I had the audacity to install a simple bird bath in my backyard, which he claimed could attract non-native species that might disrupt the lake ecosystem and decrease property values by up to 12%, according to her research. Next was a $100 fine for excessive naturalness when I didn't immediately remove a bird's nest from my porch light, followed by a $50 penalty for inadequate response time when I took 3 days to respond to her email about it. Deirdre began what I can only describe as reconnaissance missions, driving by my property multiple times a day in her golf cart that she'd modified with a plastic badge, reading Lake Patrol attached to the front, a siren she'd bought from a toy store that she'd activate when she spotted violations, and a dash cam system she claimed was for safety, but was really for building violation doses. She documented everything she deemed problematic about my property with the dedication of a crime scene investigator preparing for a murder trial. The natural curve of my rock path was labeled as provocative and potentially suggestive in her 17-page report to the board. My warm-tone porch light was deemed too coastal for our Midwest location and inconsistent with H. Heartland values as defined in her unauthorized amendments to the community standards. She even cited me for hostile semaphore because I only waved with one hand instead of both when she passed by during her patrols, claiming it violated the courtesy clause she'd invented. The rumors she spread about me at the community center and during her coffee klatch meetings were as creative as they were ridiculous and defamatory. She told neighbors I was illegally renting out my place on vacation rental sites, too questionable. Characters from the city who probably played loud music and did drugs, which I absolutely wasn't doing since I actually lived there full-time and worked from home. She claimed I held midnight concerts for the bass fish in the lake, complete with underwater speakers, laser light shows, and ticket sales that I wasn't reporting to the IRS, which is both impossible and absurd since fish lack the ability to applaud or purchase tickets through Ticketmaster. She whispered to the book club that I was probably growing illegal plants in my basement based solely on the fact that I had grow lights for my completely legal tomato seedlings and herb garden that I used for cooking. She told the church group that strange cars visited at unusual hours, when in reality it was just my weekly grocery delivery and occasionally my sister visiting from out of town. Her most technical accusation was that my keyless entry system broadcast felony waves that interfered with boat navigation systems, disrupted cell phone signals, and possibly affected the migration patterns of geese, causing them to defecate on her lawn. Specifically, when she demanded I submit duplicate keys to my house for what she called emirate board inspections, spontaneous wellness checks, and quarterly compliance audits, I politely but firmly refused after consulting with a lawyer friend who laughed for 5 straight minutes. That's when she quoted Article 12b of the bylaws, something about board access for the greater good of water and community hygiene standards with subsections about emergency mold prevention authority. I spent hours searching through the actual HOA documents, even downloading past versions from the website archives going back 10 years, and found no such article existed anywhere except in the fantasy world she constructed in her head. Saturday morning started like any other peaceful weekend, with birds chirping and coffee brewing, until I returned from grocery shopping with a trunk full of food for a barbecue. I was planning to find Deirdre and two of her most loyal board members, Barbara Chen and Harold Morrison, stationed on my private dock like an occupying force preparing for a siege. That ridiculous flotilla banner was flapping in the wind like a declaration of war, while Barbara was taking photos of my dock cleat with a tape measure for scale, and Harold was writing in a notebook with the intensity of a war correspondent. My elderly neighbor Tom was working in his garden and stopped to watch the spectacle unfold with his mouth hanging open. Before I could even ask what they were doing on my property without permission or a warrant, Deirdre marched over to my car. With the confidence of someone who'd never faced actual consequences in her entire privileged life, reached through my open window while I was still processing the invasion and holding my grocery bags, and seized my keys like she was performing a citizen's arrest on behalf of the entire lake ecosystem and property values everywhere, she announced, with a tone of manufactured urgency mixed with glee that they needed to test my interior humidity levels for mold prevention, check for unapproved electronics that might be causing interference, and ensure compliance with the new furniture arrangement guidelines she'd secretly implemented, as if that was a normal Saturday morning activity covered under standard HOA powers granted by the state. She was already heading toward my front door with that distinctive HOA President Power Walk that looked like she was permanently holding in a fart, her heels clicking against my walkway like a countdown to disaster, while her minions followed behind her like ducklings who'd lost their moral compass. I told her to stop immediately and return my keys before this escalated beyond her control and became a legal matter she couldn't talk her way out of. She spun around and accused me of obstructing lake governance and interfering with board operations, with a straight face, as if that was an actual crime listed in the state criminal code next to murder and grand. Then, in what might be the most bizarre power move I've ever witnessed in my 4 decades on this planet, including that time I saw a man try to pay for gas with Monopoly money, she produced a novelty zip tie from her pocket that looked like it came from a children's toy handcuff set and threaded it through my gate latch, declaring it an emergency lock for the safety of the community, the protection of property values, and the preservation of lakefront integrity. The click of that plastic zip tie was the last straw in a haystack of insanity that had been building for months. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, telling the dispatcher in a calm but firm voice that the HOA president had stolen my keys, was attempting to break into my house, had illegally detained my property with what appeared to be a toy lock, and had 3 accomplices who were trespassing on my dock. Tom had walked over by this point and was recording everything on his phone while shaking his head in disbelief. Deirdre's face went from smug satisfaction to confusion to dawning horror as she watched me make the call, as if she couldn't comprehend that her actions might have legal consequences beyond a strongly worded email. 2 deputies arrived within 15 minutes with their body cameras recording, And from their expressions, when they saw Deirdre standing there with my keys still in her hand like a smoking gun, I got the distinct feeling this wasn't their first encounter with her delusions of authority. Deputy Martinez actually rubbed his temples and muttered something about not getting paid enough for this before getting out of the patrol car. Deputy Chen looked at his partner and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, that he'd lost the betting pool on how long it would take before they got called out here again. I had come prepared with a folder of evidence I've been compiling for months, like a prosecutor building a RICO case, including printouts of the actual Maple Key bylaws showing no Article 12B existed anywhere in the 7-page document, the state statute on criminal trespass that I'd highlighted in yellow for easy reference, with sticky notes explaining each relevant section and, most importantly, crystal clear doorbell camera footage from 3 different angles of Deirdre reaching into my car and taking my keys while I stood there in shock holding my groceries. The deputies reviewed everything carefully, with Deputy Chin actually chuckling when he read Deirdre's mad-up article about emergency board access and mandatory key surrenders. They then asked Deirdre to return my keys immediately and apologized for the misunderstanding. She refused, with an air of indignation that would have been impressive if it wasn't so detached from reality, citing something she called implied dominion over shorelines, the maritime law of community standards, and her fiduciary duty to protect property values through proactive intervention, which sounded like something she'd made up by combining random legal terms she'd Googled 5 minutes before arriving. One deputy calmly read the criminal trespass statute, while the other looked at the welcome board inspection flotilla banner and let out a sigh that suggested he was reconsidering his career choices and maybe that job offer from his brother-in-law's security company wasn't looking so bad after all. After a quick phone call to the on-duty assistant district attorney, who apparently asked them to repeat the situation twice because she couldn't believe what she was hearing, and then asked if this was a prank call, the deputies informed Deirdre she had 2 options clearly laid out before her. She could hand over the keys right now, apologize, leave the property immediately, and receive a warning that would be documented, or she could take a ride to the station in the back of a squad car to explain the legal concepts of conversion of property, attempted unlawful entry, criminal trespass, and theft to a judge who probably wouldn't be as patient as they were being on this beautiful Saturday morning. The jingle of my keys, as she reluctantly surrendered them with shaking hands, was the sweetest sound I'd heard all month. Like wind chimes made of justice. Her face had turned the exact shade of red as her HOA president visor, and I noticed her hands were trembling as reality began to sink in like water through a cracked foundation. Barbara and Harold had already retreated to the pontoon boat and were trying to start the engine to make their escape. We held an emergency HOA meeting that evening in the community boathouse after I sent out a mass email with the subject line, "Important security footage you need to see immediately regarding your HOA president." Over 80 residents showed up, including people who hadn't attended a meeting in years, but had their own stories about Deirdre's reign of terror. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a swarm of anxious insects as I presented my case to the packed room where people were standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. I showed the doorbell footage on a laptop connected to a projector, playing it twice so everyone could fully appreciate the absurdity of their president, committing theft in broad daylight while being filmed from multiple angles. Several people gasped when they saw her reach into my car, and someone in the back yelled, "That's a felony," loud enough for everyone to hear. I displayed the phantom bylaw that didn't exist, comparing it line by line with the actual bylaws to show it was complete fiction that she'd invented to justify her actions. Then I unveiled the crown jewel of evidence that would seal her fate. A sympathetic board member named Janet, who'd finally had enough of Deirdre's antics and feared she'd be the next target, had forwarded me her entire email trail about the key registry initiative she'd been planning in secret for months. The emails detailed her vision to ensure behavioral alignment through surprise inspections at any hour, curate member interiors by forcing people to redecorate according to her personal taste, which she called Lake Country Chic, and implement a social credit system where compliance would be rewarded with reduced fees and resistance would result in escalating penalties, which translated to her walking into people's homes uninvited to judge their decorating choices and issue fines for unapproved furniture arrangements or wrong-colored towels in the bathroom. The sheriff's liaison who attended the meeting explained in very clear terms that Deirdre's emergency lock on my gate constituted criminal mischief. Her taking my keys was theft regardless of what title she held in the HOA, and her pattern of behavior could constitute harassment and stalking. The treasurer then dropped another bombshell that sent gasps and angry shouts through the room, revealing that Deirdre had spent $7,200 of the landscaping budget on custom Lake Patrol polo shirts that no one else was allowed to wear, installing a living moss wall in her home office to project eco-authority during Zoom calls, and purchasing a commercial-grade laminating machine for making official-looking but completely fabricated violation notices. She'd also spent another $3,000 on a drone she claimed was for aerial dock inspections, but was registered to her personal Amazon account and had been seen hovering over people's bedrooms. She'd used HOA funds to subscribe to multiple legal databases, trying to find justification for her actions, and had hired a private investigator to run background checks on residents she didn't like. The room erupted in angry murmurs and shouts as residents realized their increased dues and special assessments had funded her power trip and surveillance fantasies. When the vote was called, after 2 hours of heated discussion where multiple people shared their own horror stories, the results were swift and decisive. 52-3 to remove her as president, effective immediately with no severance or transition period. Permanently revoke her access to all HOA accounts and property, including the clubhouse she turned into her personal office, and referred the entire matter to the state attorney general for investigation of misuse of funds and abuse of power. Deirdre attempted what she called a filibuster about civil hydrology, watershed management rights, and her legacy of lake protection, reading from a prepared statement about her vision for the community and how we'd all regret this when property values plummeted. But the room responded with a collective groan that was distinctly Midwestern in its polite but firm dismissal, and someone actually threw a dinner roll at her. The legal consequences came down hard and fast like a thunderstorm in July. Deirdre received an Official criminal trespass warning from the court that banned her from my property for 2 years with the threat of immediate arrest and jail time if she violated it even once. The judge, who seemed personally offended by her abuse of HOA authority and mentioned he dealt with similar cases before, ordered her to pay $3,800 in restitution covering my damaged gate, legal fees, emotional distress, lost time from work, and what he specifically called punitive damages for malicious and premeditated conduct unbecoming of a community leader who should know better. Her community service assignment was the chef's kiss of karma that had the entire courtroom trying not to smile and the bailiff covering his mouth to hide his grin. Every Saturday for 6 months, without exception, including holidays, she has to staff the lost and found booth at the public boat launch from dawn to dusk, wearing a bright orange vest with text that reads, "Keys are not yours to take," in bold black letters across the back, and "Respect private property" on the front. When the judge read that last part with deliberate slowness, emphasizing each word like he was savoring a fine wine,